Their hands trembled, not from fear, but from youth. In the shadow of Berlin's crumbling skyline in May 1945, Soviet troops stumbled upon boys in oversized uniforms, barely teenagers, some still clutching Panzerfausts. A few were captured, others were shot on the spot. This is not the mythologized fall of Berlin told through generals and flags of surrender. It's a darker, often forgotten truth, one where children, sculpted into soldiers by the Nazi regime, became both its final defenders and its final victims. Why were German child soldiers executed after the war had ended? What drove Allied forces, particularly the Soviets, to treat these young fighters with such fatal finality? Were they seen as combatants or symbols of a poisoned ideology? In the chaos following Hitler's fall, the boundaries between innocence and guilt blurred. This is the story of what happened when war turned children into warriors and then judged them as such. Long before they held rifles, they carried flags and torches. From the earliest days of the Third Reich, Hitler's regime engineered a youth movement unlike any seen before. The Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth, was not just a patriotic club. It was a crucible of ideological indoctrination, physical training, and militaristic loyalty designed to mold the future warriors of the Reich. By 1936, membership was effectively mandatory for German boys aged 10 and up. They learned to march, shoot, obey, and above all, to believe. Uniformed in brown and black, they sang songs of death and sacrifice for Führer and fatherland. Discipline replaced childhood. Doubt was treason. By the time the war turned against Germany, the regime's vision of youthful purity was weaponized. In October 1944, Hitler ordered the formation of the Volkssturm, a desperate militia composed of older men and boys as young as 12. With the Allied noose tightening, these child soldiers were armed with anti-tank weapons and sent to face veteran Soviet divisions. In Berlin, Leipzig, Königsberg, and beyond, entire units of Hitler Youth were deployed to hold back the inevitable collapse. They weren't auxiliary helpers, they were treated as frontline defenders. Eyewitness accounts tell of boys manning machine gun nests, sabotaging tanks, and launching suicidal counterattacks. By 1945, many had never known a Germany without Hitler. They didn't question orders. They weren't allowed to. The Reich had stolen their childhood, and by spring, it would cost them their lives. When the Red Army broke through Berlin's defenses in April 1945, they didn't just encounter fanatical SS units. They found boys, young, frightened, often wounded, but still fighting. Some had tried to flee. Others fought to the bitter end, believing surrender meant torture or death. For many, it did. Captured child soldiers were met with a grim reality. To Soviet soldiers who had marched through the charred ruins of their own cities, these boys, no matter their age, were still armed Nazis. Revenge was instinctive. In countless cases, there was no trial, no interrogation, only execution. A boy with a rifle was a threat. A boy with a swastika was a target. Western allies, particularly the Americans and British, were more likely to detain young fighters than execute them, often sending them to POW camps or re-education facilities. But the chaos of surrender blurred protocol. In France and the Netherlands, child fighters were lynched by partisans. In Czechoslovakia and Poland, mobs exacted revenge before authorities could intervene. There was no unified policy. Some child soldiers were treated as tragic pawns, others as war criminals. The Soviet approach was the most ruthless. Teenagers fighting in Hitlerjugend divisions were often executed en masse, especially if they resisted or were found near SS units. In the disintegration of the Reich, no rank or age guaranteed mercy. And in the eyes of many Allied soldiers, a 15-year-old with a Panzerfaust was not a child, but the face of a fanatical enemy. The records are fragmented, scattered between war diaries, eyewitness testimonies, and forgotten tribunal transcripts, but they tell a chilling story. In the final days of the Battle of Berlin, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, composed largely of teenage boys, fought with near-fanatical zeal against the advancing Soviets. Survivors recall that those captured while still resisting were often executed without hesitation. One Soviet war correspondent, Vasily Grossman, described seeing children in uniform, no older than schoolboys, their faces turned to the wall, riddled with bullets. In Czechoslovakia, May 1945 brought spontaneous uprisings against remaining German forces. In Prague, a group of Hitler Youth fighters was dragged from a barricade and lynched by civilians before the Red Army arrived. Local resistance groups viewed them not as misguided children, but as extensions of Nazi terror. Further east, in Poland, Soviet-backed militias executed captured Volkssturm members, including boys aged 13 to 16, after discovering they had participated in scorched earth campaigns. In Silesia, a town mayor allegedly ordered the summary execution of 4 Hitler Youth members caught sabotaging Allied supply lines. Even in Austria, where some hoped for more leniency, several documented cases show that Hitler Youth fighters caught engaging in guerrilla attacks post-surrender were executed by both partisans and Soviet troops. The distinction between soldier and saboteur, boy and killer, dissolved in the bloodied aftermath of total war. Though not always sanctioned, these acts were rarely punished. In the haze of vengeance and occupation, child combatants were treated as tools of the Nazi war machine, used, discarded, and ultimately destroyed. Their youth, tragically, offered no immunity when the world they fought for crumbled. In 1945, there was no international law that clearly defined or protected child soldiers. The Geneva Conventions, in place at the time, dating back to 1929, offered protections for prisoners of war, but made no age distinction. As a result, the fate of child combatants was left largely to the discretion of occupying forces and local commanders. The Nuremberg trials, which would later set legal precedents for war crimes, focused on high-ranking officials and policy architects, not conscripted youth. There was no tribunal for teenage foot soldiers, nor was there consensus. To some Allied officers, these boys were tragic victims of Nazi indoctrination. To others, they were combatants who had taken up arms and thus forfeited innocence. Soviet authorities, in particular, showed little leniency. In their eyes, ideology was no excuse, especially when it came with a swastika. Young age did not absolve those who had committed sabotage, resisted arrest, or continued fighting after surrender. In Soviet-occupied zones, trials, if held at all, were swift and often ended in execution or long internment. Western allies leaned toward re-education rather than retribution, especially in the American and British zones. Captured Hitler Youth members were often placed in special camps aimed at denazification. Still, some were tried for specific crimes, particularly if accused of killing prisoners or civilians. Ultimately, the lack of legal clarity mirrored the moral ambiguity. Were these boys soldiers or victims, murderers or manipulated minds? In the lawless aftermath of the Reich's fall, answers were improvised, and too often fatal. When the dust settled and Germany lay carved into occupation zones, the story of its youngest soldiers faded into silence. Survivors, those who had fought in Hitler Youth units or been conscripted into the Volkssturm, rarely spoke. Some were ashamed, others feared retribution. Most simply wanted to forget. In West Germany, Allied forces launched denazification programs that included thousands of minors. Former child soldiers were placed in camps, schools, or rehabilitation centers. The goal? To unlearn years of propaganda and rebuild a democratic identity. While many reintegrated, the trauma lingered, buried under decades of collective guilt and post-war reconstruction. In East Germany, the narrative was more rigid. The Soviet-backed regime portrayed these youths as victims of fascism, but also as participants in its crimes. Many were watched, re-educated, or quietly absorbed into state functions. Open discussion of their roles during the war was discouraged. Few monuments marked their memory. No official apology was ever issued, and their stories were largely omitted from school books and public discourse. To remember them was to confront the uncomfortable truth that the Nazi state had turned children into killers, and that, in war's aftermath, the world didn't always know what to do with them. They were boys, shaped by a regime that promised greatness and delivered them into ruin. Germany collapsed. These young fighters became the final line of defense, not because they understood geopolitics, but because they had been taught obedience above all else. And when the Reich died, many of them died with it, some in battle, others at the hands of those who saw no child, only a uniform. The fate of German child soldiers after World War II remains one of the war's most tragic and least examined legacies. There were no parades for the survivors, no trials for the ones shot in alleys or on country roads. They became ghosts in the national memory, inconvenient reminders of how ideology can steal innocence, and how justice, when blinded by rage or urgency, can lose its moral compass. Today, international law condemns the use of child soldiers as a war crime. But in 1945, the world hadn't yet learned how to make that distinction. It simply reacted. So what do we make of these children? Trained to kill, then punished as killers? Were they soldiers, victims, or both? And more disturbingly, if the world found itself in such chaos again, would it treat them any differently?